This conference will now be recorded.
And for our session then tonight, we are talking about career challenge and opportunity. And in the environment that we are living in today with the economy as a result of what's occurred because of the COVID pandemic, there are a lot of things that are up in the air related to people's careers. But I also wanted to have this webinar discussion because this is not unique to this environment. Having worked with people for many years, facing career challenges, not being sure about focus, having a career, and then wanting to reposition in some way, this is the type of thing that goes on no matter what the economy is for various individuals and various reasons. So we're going to have a conversation about this. And my hope is with this session, it can be a bit of a mini working session. So thanks to everyone for joining. For those of you listening, I hope you find this a valuable way. We're not going to probably answer everything, but to get some things kick-started in your own particular career situation. So with that, let me just briefly introduce myself and also explain a little bit why this is a topic very near and dear to my heart. So today I run a company called Archer Career. We are an organization squarely facing career advancement and helping early career professionals both find jobs and advance within their careers. We have a series of things that we do, a set of things from technology to workshops and individual coaching. And we're very much focused on using the skills of strategy and analysis to think about how careers move forward. For me, why this topic is so important is that perhaps some of the same questions that you all have, I have faced in my own career. I'm on probably my fourth career phase. I've had many obstacles that I ran into, both as a student and working professional. And I think coming out of some of those obstacles, I learned a lot of valuable lessons, both things that I think I did well, and also some things that I wish that I had known what I know now and been able to apply in those situations. So I'll bring some of that to you throughout this conversation. While I'm kind of getting us set up, back to the chat, I'd love to maybe have each one of you express a career question that you're facing. For those of you that are on the webinar, that will help me talk directly to you. And then my bet is that across even our group, we'll see a pretty diverse set of career challenges. So go ahead into the chat and just very succinctly say, my career question right now is, and fill in that blank if you would. And part of this too is a way, I think, to realize that in facing some of our career challenges and even some of the opportunities, we're not alone in that many others have some similar questions. So let's talk about the context for this conversation. And in this, I think at times when it comes to careers, we often look around us and wonder if everyone that we know has this very straight and clear path that they're taking in their career. And in fact, we are the outsider. We are the person that doesn't quite know what we're doing, the plans that we had aren't really coming to be true, that maybe we've been in a career situation and certain things have changed, and those were not things that we had anticipated. But what it often seems like is that everything that we hear is about people that are on this career highway. Well, the fact of the matter is most people are not on a career highway. We tend to hear more about the the things that work and the people that are very focused, and when things come into the press and the news, it seems like that. But for many of us, the career path has many different branches, many different challenges. It's going in many different directions. And when faced with that, sometimes it can feel like there's just either plenty of, questions out there that we have to answer, but sometimes it's overwhelming. There are too many different things that we should be seeking out. We also sometimes feel like there are too few options, that I've gotten myself to a place, I'm sort of stuck. I have an educational background, I have experience, and there's only one way for me to go. Other questions come up with how to identify the different places where maybe my background and my interests will align. Another question is, how do I prioritize some of these things? I have a very diverse skill set, and I can't quite figure out which way to go, which opportunities are the most interesting, the most valuable, the most fulfilling. And at the end of this, I'm probably, as an individual, trying to find the right fit for me. And what does fit mean? We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But I think especially for some of you that maybe have had a career to this point and it just hasn't fit like a glove, you're looking for that right fit. Sometimes for students, whether undergraduate or graduate, we've gotten ourselves into an educational process and it didn't sort of sink. Now that we're finishing that education, we're trying to figure out what it is that puts me in the best position, to do and take advantage of that education. I mean, I found myself in that situation coming out of undergrad. I mean, I trained to be an accountant. That was my degree. I realized my senior year of college, I didn't like accounting. Well, what was I going to do next? So how do you find that right fit? And I hear, some of this even by way of your comments in the chat. Try to identify and prioritize skills that would be valuable in a career. How do you organize and, do this process of exploring different paths? So I think, just from some of the things that have already been expressed, these are some of the same, options and questions that those of you here tonight are asking. So this is really the focus of this conversation. It's around career fit. And I also think one of the challenges in our present day, and you all can tell me whether you agree or disagree with this, there's a lot of discussion about finding your career passion. And if you have your passion, you'll never be working. You'll just be fulfilled. And I believe that there is a lot of pressure to feel that sense of passion. And I love my work, and therefore it's not work. I perhaps am a little more pragmatic. I might be slightly jaded because of my 30 years of work experience. I don't necessarily focus on passion. I mean, I think there are some things that drive your attention, but I think a lot more about fit. And so for me, the way that I think about fit is you are a person and a professional, and you have a certain set of characteristics. You have a certain set of priorities. You have a certain phase in your life. you have certain goals and objectives. The fit is when you can put all of those things that encompass who you are and what you want into the right role and the right opportunity that makes sense for you. And that's kind of the entree that we're going to take into this conversation. And time again, and research tells us that fit is one of the most important characterizations. So what does that mean? Well, because we're talking about this in the context of a job, the way that we'll outline a job is the kind of work you do, which is often the job function, the scope of work, how narrow, how big, how wide. Sometimes it's your title, the position. Are you a leader? Are you an individual contributor? Are you an expert? Are you a generalist? I mean, there's a bunch of things that go into actually those three elements. The salary, the compensation that you receive, other characteristics of that job, flexibility, structure, the hierarchical nature of an organization, the organization's stage of growth. Is it a public company? Is it a private company? Is it a family-owned company? Is it an academic environment? Is it a research environment? Is it a global company? Is it a local company? There's all these different characteristics of organizations that you might be a part of, for-profit, nonprofit, lots of these things. Another characteristic is the way that you want to make an impact. What is it that you're trying to do and you're trying to achieve? People that work in financial services are squarely trying to impact the movement of money, the movement of capital. People who work in research are trying to expand a body of knowledge, trying to expand science, trying to find discoveries, and then there's a whole lot of things in between, okay? Sometimes people are looking for career growth. I talk to a lot of professionals that really love what they do. However, there's a bit of a stagnation, or in their organization, they've kind of reached the plateau of where they might go given a certain set of obstacles. So sometimes fit is about where you are in your career development. And then the final piece sometimes is just how you're using a set of what we call KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. What sometimes happens with people in fit is that you're using skills, but they're not skills that you necessarily want to be using. They're not the things that really connect the most with you, or they're not things that are the most valued within your organization. And sometimes there's a mismatch here, and that can create a lot of tension when you're looking at fit. So the takeaway of some of this, when it comes down to a job, finding career fit is it's a complex equation. It has multiple different dimensions, and then it's also very different for each one of you. So no two people have the same makeup. It's a bit like our DNA. So what might be important to me in terms of title might be different for someone else. What might be important in terms of career growth, we're all going to have different expectations and desires. So this is one of the other things that makes this a little bit tricky, is that many times we're comparing ourselves to peers. We may hear from people that says, hey, I just took this job. Oh, it's fantastic. I love this organization. You should come work with us. And then that happens and you find yourself not having those same connections. Well, sometimes it's just because the two people are different and neither one is right or wrong. but having this assessment for yourself of what is the career fit that you're looking for. So if you all think about this, it's very much like planning a journey. So of course, in our environment today, planning journeys it's a little far reaching, but we'll use the analogy. I'm not just gonna go get in my car and drive. I mean, some people may love that. But if I'm gonna take, a driving trip, I need to have some considerations for that. And each one of us may have different interests in what that is. So we have to have some kind of idea of these characteristics very broadly so that then we can focus our attention. Okay, and then some of the trick of that is, well, how do you do that exploration? And that's what we're going to talk about shortly. So when you have this understanding of your expectations around fit, then what it does is it leads to more clarity about the career path or paths. So for some people, it's plural because there is more than one place that you can go. For others, it's much narrower. And that just, again, depends on some circumstances. So I am generally okay if you narrow some of those career paths, but what we want to avoid is kind of the extremes, like having so many options that it's overwhelming, or having only one option, and then in a circumstance when that one option doesn't come to be, that we're devastated, right? And I can tell you guys, I mean, I'm living in that environment right now. So I have a couple of clients that I'm coaching that are on those extremes, right? I'm working with an undergraduate student at a top university. And coming out of that university, quite honestly, this person could probably do anything. That's an impossible situation, because how do you prepare, how do you apply for jobs that are anything? That doesn't work. How do you prepare for interviews for jobs that are anything? It doesn't work. And then on the other extreme, I have a few clients, a handful of them actually, that are interviewing for consulting positions as experienced candidates, so not coming out of a degree program. And in the environment right now, hiring is extremely difficult, even for the best prepared. And so a couple of people have had an interview and it has not translated into an offer, unfortunately. Right? And when that happens and you've set your sights on that pinpoint, then you almost have no visibility into what comes in the future beyond that. And then also the weight of that disappointment, it's much greater, right? And there's a lot of theory behind resilience that says that particular circumstance is not great. And it, by the way, also creates a huge amount of pressure when in that interview circumstance, because all of that weight comes bearing down on us. So there's some thinking behind this that we want to try to do. So part of it is beginning with this understanding of what gets in our way. So let me pose this question to those of you on the webinar live. When you all are thinking about exploring career paths and prioritizing what kind of things you want to do in your career, what are a couple things that get in your way? And I'm going to give you guys a couple seconds. I'd love to hear from as many of you as possible. Let's just put keywords into the chat. What stands in the way of moving forward with some of this? So some of it is feeling like you don't have relevant experience. Yes, absolutely. We'll talk about that, by the way, shortly. What else? What's standing in our way? Excellent. I have another response that says, I don't want to pick the wrong thing. Another point, I don't know what the company wants. So it's kind of hard for me to create that fit when I don't know what the company wants. Other thoughts? This is the one. There's a couple thoughts here with the next response. So self-doubt, certain feelings, fear of failure, having certain goals like compensation, wanting to feel connected to the company and their values, which at times can seem really difficult, right? So this is great. I mean, this is great. What if I put a lot of that together, the thoughts that you all have submitted, one of the ways I would summarize that is that sometimes we are in our own way because of two sides of this. So on one side, we place pressures on ourselves, or we're not honest with ourselves about what's really important. And also in that grouping of what we kind of place on ourselves is that we're not always able or willing to make tough choices. Now, on the other side, there are a bunch of external factors that are somewhat out of our control. Some of it is the economic climate, some of it is the recruiting choices of companies, some of it is the transparency of companies, some of it is the ways that recruiting happens and access to some of those things, so think about these things. And when I look at that picture, I can affect the things that are in my control. And I can affect my own thinking, my own self-assessment, my expectations, my mindset. There's a lot of things that are external that I can't affect. I can't affect the economy. I can't change the recruiting practices of a company until I go work there and I work in senior HR positions, which is a little bit far-fetched, but but there's sort of understanding what I can and cannot do, and then focusing my attention on the side of what I can impact. Okay, and so those are some of the things that I want to take us through in terms of a few activities. And what I'm going to give you all in this next bit of discussion are some of the things that I do with my clients, right? These are preview activities, and with good discipline and some self-reflection, and maybe a partner or a couple of colleagues. I mean, this is something that I do think having colleagues and doing as a team sport matters. So the hardest part about it is being honest with yourself. And before I get into some of the activities, I'll tell you guys how important this is. So I think for a very long time, I lacked honesty with myself about how I was and who I was as a working professional. I wanted those high salary positions. I wanted certain titles. I wanted to work in prestigious companies. I had a phenomenal education. I got my MBA at Chicago Booth, which, by certain measures is a phenomenal MBA program. And I wanted to keep pace with my peers. But I think where I had a lack of my own recognition was that I like to work a certain way. I like to work with autonomy. I like to do things that are a little bit against the grain. I like to be super innovative. I like to make my own decisions and live or die by them. There were just a lot of things that I was not being really honest with myself about, and then trying to climb the corporate hierarchy. And it just kept bouncing back and punching me in the face. And at a certain point in time, I finally figured that out. It took a really long time. And that was partially my fault because I kept seeing the signs and I kept reading the tea leaves. And I had these signals, but I just wasn't allowing myself to acknowledge those signals. So this is one of the things that I learned my own lesson. I have no regrets about any of those interim steps and, kind of zigzags. But I think I knew that some of those signs were there early on. And quite honestly, if I went back to it, I could probably see them in my early 20s. It took me until my mid 40s to actually act on them. So I appreciate some of the circumstance of both those of you that are in your early career, some of you that are in your mid career. But my point is, a lot of times these signals are there sitting in front of us. We just have to be willing to hear them. So what does that mean? I'm going to take you through a set of questions. And in this time, we're going to work through these fairly quickly and without judgment. We're not going to answer constraints. We're not going to make excuses. We're just going to talk about a couple things. So what I would love to have you do is in your notes, write down question 1, and I want you to answer what your must-haves constraints are in these dimensions. So money, title, geography, values, and principles. Okay, and let me talk about this for just a minute, and then I'll give you guys a couple of minutes to write those things down. While I'm talking, be thinking, but listen for a second. So money is a powerful motivator, and everybody has a different relationship with money. Money causes us to make good decisions and bad decisions. What you have to have is an honest conversation with yourself about money. And every single one of my clients, we have this very, very difficult conversation, and people are often a bit taken aback by one of my very first questions, which is, how much money do you make? Like base salary, bonus. I want the details. And then I ask questions about, what is a livable wage for you? And what is your balance sheet? So again, I have a training in accounting. I have a balance sheet. A balance sheet is all of the assets that I have and all of the liabilities that I have. So assets would be, any checking account money, things in the bank, savings, maybe you have a car, and liabilities are your bills, your mortgage, credit cards, school loans, if you have those. And then sometimes people have others that they are taking care of. You have to have a really good situation of knowledge, because the choices that we make will be affected by this balance sheet. And I have had people that I've worked with who have had to walk away from amazing professional opportunities because simply they could not afford the salary. I do not judge that. That is the right thing to do, because in Maslow's hierarchy, we have to be able to pay our bills, right? So you have to have a good understanding of this. And then also, some people view money as a scorecard. In different cultures, this has a different impact. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I think it's an enormous question. And you, again, have to be very honest with yourself about that and not apologize for it. Okay. Then there are things that are a little more, him, haw, titles. People who are already in their career tend to be concerned about that. What if I take a job and I go backwards, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other thing is sometimes when you do go backwards, employers are concerned about that. Again, basics. These days, geography is a little bit of a kind of muddled up mess because there's many remote opportunities, but some people have a priority around where you have to be in terms of your role. There are some people that have more of a global presence and want to be doing things outside the country, et cetera. You can think about that. And then there's this last dimension of values and principles. And this is where things get both interesting and sticky. We have to know this. And I had a very interesting epiphany about this the other day. And I think, again, it's something that I probably knew about myself. But I had an old friend of mine, literally someone I've known for 30 years since my undergrad days, who sent me a text message. We hadn't talked in a while, and she made a comment about just some of the things, some of these webinars, thanking me for doing this. And her comment said something about watching my career and seeing this thread of integrity. And it caught me because I think one of my strengths and weaknesses is that I put this very hard line in the sand about integrity. I always want to do the right thing. I don't like it when there are games being played. I don't like kind of political things. I like decisions to be very open and transparent, et cetera, et cetera. But it hit me because I was impressed that this other person saw this in me. And then it reminded me of a truth and where I've had some conflicts in prior places in my career. So while I give you guys a few minutes to write some of these things down, I'm going to put up the list of values. And so what I want to do is I'm going to give you 90 seconds to make a list of the must-haves or the constraints around money and title, and maybe geography for you, maybe values. And in this list of values, as hard as it might seem, I want you to pick 5 of them. Okay, and then I'll tell you guys a little bit of trick about this once we finish our 90 seconds, okay? So I'm gonna say 3, 2, 1, go, and then I'm gonna give you that 90 seconds, okay? So please, 3, 2, 1, go. So about 30 more seconds. Okay, so a couple things with this question. Let me go back. So one of the reasons why, oops, excuse me, I like to have this first question is because it helps to be able to eliminate things. The act of saying no to certain things is powerful. And in the world of exploring careers and making choices, one of the best things that you can do is to eliminate options. And that may sound 100% insane, especially in an environment like today where it seems that options are limited. But I have found it to be true. And it's very hard to do. But when you come back and you think about these, must-haves, and especially some of the values, it becomes a powerful tool, and I'll give you guys an example. So I remember this very vividly, and it was probably 7-ish years ago, and there's a reason why. So I was pregnant with my sons. I have twin sons who are now 7.5. So it was about 7 years ago. And I got an email from a recruiter who was not looking for a job. The person found me on LinkedIn. And that recruiter was with a company called Bridgewater. If you don't know Bridgewater, if you do, you don't need me to explain, but Bridgewater is one of the largest hedge funds in the world. The founder of Bridgewater is a gentleman named Ray Dalio, who is quite, famous in terms of leadership. And the recruiter liked my background and wanted to talk to me about a role in their leadership team in the human capital arena. And it's incredibly, flattering. And I had a couple of conversations with this individual. I also happened to have a really good friend who was a consultant, and that person's biggest client was Bridgewater. So I knew a bit about their culture. And so after, having a couple of these rounds of conversations, my next step was to fly out to the East Coast and have some interview conversations. And I didn't want to do this without feeling some degree of seriousness. And by the way, I mean, this very likely was a job that could have been, 7 figures in terms of total compensation. I mean, it was a fairly senior opportunity. Ultimately, I decided not to do it, and could have been timing, trying to think about having, twin babies and moving and having a really senior job. But some of it came down to, me thinking about priorities and the kind of things that really motivate me. And some of it has to do with the kind of businesses that I like to be a part of. A hedge fund, although I respect certain aspects to it, there are dimensions that don't quite work for me. Some of it had to do with being a part of a large organization, and some of it had to do with the fact that when I had worked as a consultant, I started not being my true self. I started playing the game that was necessary to advance in leadership. And maybe that was a dumb choice of mine. I have no idea. I can't go back and dial up the time clock and go backwards. But I had complete clarity about it. And when I spoke to the recruiter, it was a very engaging conversation. And I've had that happen. So that was 7 years ago. I probably had that happen 3 times since. And so those saying no scenarios are one of the hardest things that one can do in their career, but it also gave clarity, because then the kinds of things that I was pursuing, I did so with a lot of rigor and a lot of focus. Okay. These questions serve as a guide and being honest with yourself. Okay. And then, by the way, other people are going to make different decisions. So My choices are mine. And by the way, when I have clients, I have given them information and insight that would drive a decision such as that in somewhat the opposite direction, right? So I have encouraged, through the coaching that we do, somebody has gone into a hedge fund. So it's personal for me, and that's, the whole point. So the second question then we move into, and some of you were asking this in the chat, what is your specific knowledge, skills, and abilities? And I break this down into a couple of things, and I think some of you were asking this question. So one is to think about your education. The other is to think about experience, paid and unpaid. And then also to think about your talent. And talent is a little bit murky to wrap your head around, but it's the kind of stuff that you are really, really good at. And it comes a bit naturally, but also there's some hard work behind it. Okay. When we look at knowledge, skills, and abilities, they are repeated. Sometimes they are also unused. And if you're in a job or a career path now, it could be that you have some KSAs and they're just not being fully used in your current position. The other thing that you want to do when you answer this question is to ask if they're commercially valued, meaning people that hire you, do they value those things? And so how do you discover this? Well, it's a couple of different things. So one is going back and self-assessing. So if you've had work experience, looking at performance reviews, looking at emails that people have sent you, if you have testimonials that you've gained, if you have at a student level, if you have papers or if you have professors, what comments have they written? So getting other people's take. In addition, you can look at certain job positions and so postings, whether it's Indeed or LinkedIn, et cetera, and look at the way that they're describing certain jobs and then try to figure that out, okay? And this is where then you've got to come back and be honest with yourself and try to figure out what things you have and what things that you don't have. It doesn't hurt to ask people, and this is where kind of the fear comes into play. When I was a strategy consultant and I was trying to make a career change, I had conversations with many people, and part of it was, if it was someone who knew me, what would be things that they would say were skills that I had? And then I would throw out a couple of ideas about potential career paths. And I would say, what's your take on that? Am I crazy? And some people would say, well, yeah, you'd be really good at that. And then other people would be like, no, you'd be terrible at that. And I had to stitch together a couple of conversations. Okay. I mean, at one point I thought about going into sales for technology solutions because I have a lot of background in technology. I had done consulting and business development. I like people. I'm reasonably extroverted. And a couple people reminded me that I've actually never sold anything and that I actually don't like rejection. And these are a couple of things, and I don't like the gamesmanship sometimes that has to go on. A bunch of things that people told me. And I was like, wow, that's really good input because I bet I wouldn't be a very good salesperson. So asking other people, talking to people in the field, listening to panels, having, there's so much information these days, trying to get at some of this stuff and finding those things that you do that really stand out. And generally, when it's things that you do that stand out, people will hire you to use those skills. Okay. Now, sometimes people are trying to change careers. And this can get really tricky because you may say to yourself, well, I don't have any of those skills. Sometimes students have this issue. Well, I want to get into this role. I need to have experience. I'm a student. I don't have it. Well, you have to then be creative. You may have to look at other things besides paid jobs. And then sometimes you have to talk and tell people with confidence, right? But the first part is, what are those sort of elements? Knowledge, skills, and abilities, okay? And we won't spend time doing that today, but I encourage you all to go out and research this. You know, if you're interested in data analytics, go research it. Go look at Amazon, go look at McKinsey, who has data analytics positions. Look at the best in breed and look at the expectations that they have in those positions. If you're interested in policy roles, talk to people that are in those positions. If you want to open a yoga studio, talk to people who have done it and ask lots of very good and deep questions. And then come back and do some self-assessment. Okay, this is not easy. This takes some time, but it will help. It will help again with some of the elimination of paths that seem far-reaching, right? And I had a client some years ago who was trying to get into senior leadership, and this was one of the conversations that we had, because this person was trying to think about like a chief operating officer role or a CFO role, and their skills fit the CFO side a lot better. But this person didn't necessarily want to do some aspects of the CFO, things like treasury, some of the controllership, some of the process. So we ended up looking at companies that needed more of a strategy oriented CFO, that were doing maybe a little bit of corporate development and acquisition strategy, that they prioritize that. So that was this combination of looking at the skills of a particular role, mapping back to both skills and likes, and then finding organizations that ultimately valued that. Okay. So the next area then gets down to one of the main points of this conversation, which is around scenarios. So when you do this work on yourself and the skills, kind of the things that you want and the skills, then it allows you to come up with a list of alternative futures, right? And that's what we're trying to do, is have a reasonable idea of what are the potential pathways that you could go down. And this is something that's very common in business, whether it's in finance or corporate strategy. And it's just a great skill to both inventory, to see many possibilities, and then to prioritize, again, which things are in, which things are out. And doing it is not difficult, but again, it requires a little bit of discipline. So it's listing scenarios. So for a second, I want to maybe, with all of you that are here tonight, and then those of you that are listening, kind of follow this thought process, right? So in your notes, write down 3 potential career path options for you that are maybe realistic. And some of it could be continuing in your current role or the current kind of path or related to your degree. Some of it could be a bit of a nudge. little bit of a twist, a turn, right? But just write down 3 that seem reasonable, realistic to you. Just write down 3. Okay, now the next thing I want you to do is write down one thing that's a dream. You know, if I could, of all the things out there, do X. I would do this. Unconstrained, don't worry about whether it's practical or not, or feasible. Don't worry about how much it pays. Just do it. Then what I want you to write down is your greatest fear professionally. Like what for you right now, where you are, would be, if you want to call it a failure, if you want to call it a serious setback, what would that be? So these become your scenarios. And there's a little more to it, but to help with this activity so that you can continue this after our conversation. So one of the things that we want to do in our career is to inventory what we can think about, like the best options, good outcomes. And in those options, we have realistic, and then we have the best case, the dream. And sometimes we don't have that dream right in front of us. It might not be there yet. That's okay. What you want to do if you're struggling a little bit to find that dream is to put down a bunch of ideas on the page, right? So if any of you had trouble with that one dream job, you take out, you know, when you do this weekend or tomorrow, you take out the sheet of paper and you create a list. All right, so I would love to have my own coffee shop. I have a place that I visited some years ago in Prague, and I have always wanted to import that to my hometown. And my little suburb of Chicago, we don't have any local coffee shops. We only have a Starbucks, which is fine, but I'd like something local. And of course, right now, it would have a huge outdoor patio. So that might be one of my dreams. I would also like to run a year-round camp for adults, because every summer I send my kids to camp and I'm super jealous. I've always wanted to be a travel guide. Again, might not happen near term. And, you know, and so on and so on. So you put down this laundry list and then you come back and you ask yourself, what are the common threads? Right? My dream used to be, when I went and got my MBA, my dream was to become an academic. I actually did that. And I still teach. And I loved it. I was very fulfilled. I do it less today because professionally, I don't have as much bandwidth. And I learned a little bit about what being an academic was. I don't do it full time anymore. But at one point, that was on my best case scenario. Okay, now we come to that worst case. There are a couple things that you do with the worst case. So one is you say to yourself, well, how do I prevent the worst case scenario? And that then create some action planning. The other thing to do is, if in the worst case scenario, could you make it? Would it be fine? And many times we've made the worst case scenario far worse than it would ever be, right? So I run my own company. I think about it often. What if literally 100% of my business went away? And that thought always seemed very distant until about March 15th. And I sat back and I said, all right, let's say that literally every single client of ours walked away and I had no revenue. What would I do? And I figured it out. I've always had this thought that, I could go work at Starbucks. I could go deliver packages for Amazon. I love the container store. Now, granted, again, in our current environment, these things are difficult. And I would maybe do some of that stuff and then I'd write a book about it. But I would, it's like in that worst case scenario, if I play that out right now, for some of us, that is a much more difficult situation. Sometimes there are some very, very fundamental things, but we have to imagine that scenario and then we can plan for it. We can be prepared. And I have a client who in March was separated from their position, and it completely caught them off guard. And the psychology of that is extremely difficult, and it took them several months to kind of come out of. It's almost like a grief scenario. And so I always work through those worst case scenarios because then it gives me the freedom to do some planning and to also realize that the worst case scenario is not always the end of the world, but each of you has to think about that because there are some people that without employment, things are really, really dire. So I don't want to diminish that at all. But the third thing in these scenarios is there may be stuff that you don't know. And this is where conversations with people are tremendously valuable to say, I have this background and I like solving these types of puzzles or these types of problems. What are opportunities that I could think about? And if you have friends, if you have mentors, if you have faculty, if you have access to career offices in places where you're alumni, if you get a chance to attend, talks, reading stuff. I mean, there's so many things that we don't know. And I never knew that there was this job that I could be paid to be a career coach. I mean, I was at a networking event and I was talking to some people about what I wanted to do. And somebody said, well, you could go work here. And they have career coaches. Like, I didn't know that. It means that you've got to be open to conversation. And then the final thing is there might be things that you know, but you've not allowed yourself to consider. You've put up the constraints. I'm an expert in this, and therefore I can't not do that, right? Or, oh, I think that I could do this, but I don't have this, and I don't have this, and I don't have this. So having that inventory and at least kind of bringing it front and center, that list of scenarios gets a bit longer, and it also starts to allow you to prioritize it, right? And even when I think about this crazy list of the best case scenarios, what I sometimes can do is run a link through them, connect those dots, and start to see that there might be a job that is more realistic. So I think about somebody who is a finance professional. And it's like, I love education. Well, I don't want to be a teacher, but there's a lot of educational technology companies who need finance people. It could be that, again, back to the travel. It's like you like the travel industry, but it doesn't make sense to do this, but they have these other type of professionals, or maybe research is your real love and interest. And there's different types of entities that do research. Amazon has research people. There are a number of different biotech companies that have research. Depends on your background, right? So trying to find the connections, that's key. So do some of that thinking and, do it in small increments. Sometimes people try to take 2 or 3 hours at a time and have these great brainstorming sessions. Sometimes just 15 minutes is really productive. So what this means is you got to work through a lot of things, and especially that worst case, right? Because it will help you handle the ebbs and flows, the ups and downs, and how do you again get from the place that you are to that next place, right? So when I'm having my worst day, I just talk about going and being a barista at Starbucks. And then I think to myself, well, the perks of that would be, although I would probably be terrible at it because I think all of those very picky coffee requirements might put me a little bit over the edge after times. But, I have that as kind of my resilience meter. When I'm having a bad day, at the end of the world, I could go do this, right? So the next thing then that comes into this is research. And I'm not going to underplay this at all. Research, doing homework, really, really digging in and asking questions and talking to people and not being, again, fearful of reaching out to people and saying, I'm interested in the work that you do. What are the kinds of things you do? What are the kind of challenges that you solve? And when you're hiring people, what is it that you're looking for? And that is something super powerful. And to be honest, when I was making my career change, I spent 3 months doing research. I had a lot of different conversations, and it was invaluable. I will tell you when I didn't do it. At one point in my career, I was considering going into executive search. I jumped at it. I had an opportunity to do an interview with one of the leading executive search companies in the world, Spencer Stuart. I thought I kind of knew, and I did not do enough homework. And therefore, in the interview setting, I emphasized 80% of one thing, 20% of the other, and I needed to invert that emphasis. And it was just, I was younger and more naive. So research, research, research. And you can research in a lot of ways and try to do things that are simple, that are cost effective, that are relevant to the here and now, because things are moving quickly. So sometimes it's coursework, and these days coursework there's a vast spectrum of it. There's degree coursework, there's certificate coursework, there's Coursera, there's Khan Academy, right? You don't have to be necessarily involved in a degree program, but try to get things that are really relevant, right? And be quick about it if you can. And training and webinars like this. And one of my favorite things to do is to go out to LinkedIn and look at career professionals and work backwards. How has their career evolved? And that's a fantastic way to figure out what skills people have worked their way through, because they'll have some stuff in their LinkedIn profiles. You can also learn by way of doing some things and getting experience, whether it's internships, and internships are very broad these days, certain part-time jobs and working for startups and doing volunteer roles. And if you're a student, doing class projects, working with professors. And by the way, this isn't just limited to students. I think that there's a lot of ways that people nowadays can do side hustles, shadow, these type of things. And even in a virtual environment, a remote environment of today, we can still do some of those things. And the other areas of development are just knowledge, speaking to different professionals, going to presentations, watch certain things that you can access, reading, bios, articles, books, podcasts. I mean, there's so many things that are out there, and to try to make it not so overwhelming, time box it, take a half an hour here, 15 minutes there, and do a little bit each time, because I know it can feel a little bit overwhelming. And that's one of the things that even I do today. I mean, occasionally I have an opportunity to work with someone who's in a career field that I may have a high level understanding of, but maybe not as deep. And I'm a generalist. So what I will do is this same type of research. I go out, I start with LinkedIn profiles. I then go to job descriptions. And then I might listen to, certain podcasts of people in a field, right? Or I might go to professional associations in a field. I worked with a high school teacher some years back, and to be honest, it was the first time I'd ever worked with a teacher doing a resume, and it was someone who was thinking about moving out of teaching. And I did a tremendous amount of research on what were policy organizations, what were some of the charter schools, what was an administrative role, what were different startups that maybe focused on technology for, kind of elementary and secondary education, and I picked out, maybe 10 things that I would go and research to try to figure out what skills could be drawn from this person's background as a teacher. I also had another woman I worked with who was a teacher and then went to get an MBA and a law degree and wanted to be in consulting. We did the exact same thing and tried to figure out where were there certain skills from that teaching experience that cross applied. And although I was at that time very familiar with the consulting job, what I needed to understand was more of the teaching side so that I could create a bridge between those worlds. And so we talked to former teachers that were consultants. Okay, so research is a huge area. And, some of this is trying to figure out, what sorts of things that you need to learn about. All right, so the last thing that I'm going to speak to, and then I'm happy to take any questions or clarify, is this idea of your preparation and going a little bit of the extra mile, if you will. And, when we're trying to find and navigate, and we've had, maybe some interest in making a career change, or we're in an environment today where the opportunities are not seemingly as plentiful, we just have to prepare. We have to do a little bit more than what we might think, or we might have to do things a little bit differently. So I was captivated to kind of have sort of an example of this. So I happen to be a football fan, NFL football, and I was watching something, one of the games, and the picture that I have here is a running back from the New Orleans Saints, a guy named Alvin Kamara, and he's probably one of the most talented running backs in the NFL. What they were talking about on this little snippet is how he trains. So he's a running back, and running backs carry the ball and they run between 200-300 pound linemen. And what he's doing in his training is he's standing on top of a ball and he's catching things. Well, what he's training to do is balance and to be nimble, because if you have any interest, watch clips of this guy in games. It's unbelievable. He almost defies gravity. And so when I'm watching this, of course, he's an athlete, so he has to do this stuff. I just thought to myself, wow, he's building a whole bunch of skills that are correlating to his success as an NFL running back, but they're not obvious. So a lot of wide receivers, the guys who catch the ball in the NFL, they do ballet, because ballet builds muscles, it builds balance. I'm also a big tennis fan. The tennis players do all these different drills that have nothing to do with swinging a racket, serving, hitting forehands and backhands. And that is something that when we take that into the world of careers, we want to think about how we prepare and maybe doing a little bit extra. So I'll give you guys another example. So last year, my husband actually went through a job search, and he had been working in ministry for a number of years. Previous to that, he worked in technology, but he wanted to go back. And some of the input that he was getting from his networking was that he'd lost a lot of his technology skills. He wasn't up to date. But he did have an interview with a company that was a technology company, and they sent him a demo of their software. And he watched it. Of course, I get a chance to observe this because he's doing this at home. And he must have run through, and it was a demo video, probably ran through it at least 5 times. And the first time was kind of to watch. The second time he took notes. The third time he kind of asked questions, and then he sort of did it a couple more times to review a few things. And then he went in, and one of the first questions that he was asked in the interview, what'd you think of the demo? And he was able to spend like 10 minutes, told me this after the fact, he was able to spend about 10 minutes talking about his observations from that demo, things that he noticed, things that he thought were challenging, questions about why things were done a certain way. And a lot of the rest of the interview was spent on the job, doing the job, the challenges, the expectations, the priorities, right? And now what's fascinating, so he was offered that position. Now he's in a position where he's hiring candidates for his same job. And one of the things that he now notices is the difference between person A and person B based on that degree of preparation. So I offer that as the, example of when you're trying to navigate your way, when you want to make something happen, and especially if it's kind of hard, if it's challenging, if it's something that you're not as comfortable with, kind of going that extra mile will make an enormous difference, right? And then all of these pieces, by the way, fit together. Because if you're not sure about the path that you want to go down, one of the indicators that you might be going down the right path is that when you get into it and you start researching and working and talking about it, it's really interesting. It's really exciting. And again, I know from my personal experience, one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on career coaching is I loved reading people's resumes. I still do. I find it insightful. I find it fascinating. I find it creates a connection between me and a person that I I might not get in some other form, because people have really interesting things, and I find that I learn, which is something that is really important to me. So think about all those things and take them as next steps. And just a couple of closing points. So when you take all this together and you're trying to find the focus, the next steps, one thing is to resist this idea that you can do anything you want. The truth is we can't. And that's also overwhelming. I can't be a chef. I love cooking. I enjoy buying cookbooks, but I just can't be a chef. First of all, I'm too old to get into that game. Now, I guess if I really wanted to, I could, but I'm not willing to make those sacrifices to do that. So it's a choice, but I still can't do anything I want. On the other hand, don't say to yourself, I can't do anything. There's no place for me. There's no options. There's no hiring. That's also a defeatist attitude that doesn't help. It's not productive. The third point is know thyself. Have those honest conversations, and it's okay to say no to certain things, or to say this is a must. That is to have that honest conversation is good. And then the final thing is experiment and take small steps. Sometimes it can be doing a certain thing on a volunteer basis. Sometimes it can be having a side hustle. That's a bit how I got into coaching. I did a lot of volunteer work when I was in my full-time consulting positions. I was on our recruiting teams. I would give back as an alumnus, and I took a lot of small steps. But even when I took the job full-time, I gave myself kind of 1-year milestones. It's like, I'm going to try this for a year, and I'm going to have this assessment at the end of the year. And, if it doesn't go well, okay, I'll move on to perhaps something different. All right. And those small steps help us kind of overcome those fears of commitment, fears that I've made the wrong decision, et cetera, et cetera. All right, everyone. So I want to kind of end my comments, but if there is anything specific I could address in terms of a question or a comment or provide a little bit of feedback, I'm happy to take a couple minutes to do that. Any questions or comments? And feel free to take yourself off mute or put it in the chat. And there's also a private feature on the chat. All right. So let me pose one last question. What would you guys do next? And you don't have to answer that in the chat, but put it down in your notes. Like, if you could do 3 things, start tomorrow, start the next day, what might you define for yourself? And it's not something that takes hours, right? Put that down in your notes. And I think that that's in this area to help you consistently feel like you're moving forward. Just try to identify a couple things that you can do that are small steps. And eventually those small steps lead to big steps. They lead to breakthroughs, they lead to ahas, but also just help yourself find that sense of progress. Okay. All right. Thank you guys for joining, listening, your engagement, and just a couple of closing things. Again, on our website, archercareer.com, under Insights, I'll be posting the webinar. There's some other things there. We'll be continuing to have some new and interesting sessions coming up in a few weeks. I'm very excited. We're about ready to put out the rest of our calendar through the end of the year. And please share with others. We're doing all these webinars for sure for the foreseeable future to be open to anyone. We want to just be as supportive as we can to communities of professionals and job seekers that are looking for a little bit of guidance. So do please share and come to our website to find out what things might be relevant for you. All right. All right, everyone. I'm going to wrap us up for the evening then. Thanks again. Have a good rest of the week.